Right, here we go. My name is Eliat Aram. I'm the Chief Executive of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. I'm excited, I'm nervous. I'm going to tell you a story. It's my story. It's my version of the Institute story, and it's an untold story. So you are reading it, hearing it, listening to it for the first time. It hasn't written before. What is the story that I'm going to tell you today? I'm going to tell you the story of the Tavistock Institute as an orphan. Take orphan as an identifier, as a metaphor, and as a lived experience. Take it as an individual experience, as a group phenomenon, as an organizational culture. Think about what being an orphan might mean to you personally, professionally perhaps, and what characteristics an orphan might have, and what behaviors an orphan might display. This story is a three-dimension trip through the history of the Institute's 7 decades, the personal dimension of the employees, the work that they have carried out, and events that have happened to the Institute as a whole. Yes, the Tavistock Institute as an orphan. I'm going to tell you that throughout its 70 years of history, the Tavistock Institute itself has been full of and alive with experiences of orphanness and abandonment, that the Institute's identity as an organizational misfit, a refuge, is rooted in a lived experience of profound internal loneliness that comes from having had an early experience of being orphaned or abandoned, perhaps rejected, and put in one type or another of care. I'm going to tell you that the orphan identity is co-created, and that it is because of these experiences and because of this identity that the Tavistock Institute and its employees have made it their mission, unfailingly throughout 70 years of work that would go beyond their own lifetime, to look after the institutions and people whose roles are to look after children, those who were orphaned or otherwise abandoned. I'm also going to tell you a story which is not sad, but is of course emotional. The novel is a literary genre which typically represents the effort of an ordinary individual to navigate their way through the trials of life. The orphan is essentially a novelist character, and in this talk novella, our protagonist is the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, an independent, autonomous, defiant, and self-sufficient social science organization. Orphans have a special place in the history of the novel, especially in the 19th century, half a century at least before our Tavistock story begins. Although orphaning your main character was fictionally useful, there is a real social history behind these fictional orphans, and it is into this real social history that the Tavistock Institute enters and begins its work. The literary orphan is above all a character out of place, forced to make his or her own home in the world. In children's fiction, Little Goody Two-Shoes, Annie, protagonist of The Secret Garden, Anne of Green Gables, Tom Sawyer, and Ballet Shoes, to name a few, the orphan will eventually find the happiness to compensate for having been deprived of parents, and the stories. Oh my God, here begins the mess. Second. I knew I should have read my notes just before because I mixed them up. Okay, if you say so. Let me just find this. I think I'm missing a page. Let's see. Yes. The stories begin because they find themselves without parents, unleashed to discover the world. The most famous character in recent fiction, Harry Potter, is an orphan. The child wizard's adventures are based on the death of his parents and the responsibilities that he must therefore assume. We can find similar motifs in almost all of Walt Disney's animations, from Bambi to Simba in The Lion King to Arlo in The Good Dinosaur, and at least 15 other Disney characters, from Princess and the Frog to Lilo and Stitch to Frozen, and including the animation of old classics like Cinderella, Snow White, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and so on. Interpretations of why that is include a narrative that Walt Disney blamed himself for the death of his mother in a fire, which was caused in a home that he purchased for them. And since then, he developed characters who were often come great explorers, leaders, or world changers. The literary orphan, like the systemic psychoanalyst, social scientist, the social anthropologist, the Tavistockian, is a mirror to the qualities of others. The Tavistock Institute identity is co-created through and by the work carried out in it as much as by the life journeys of its employees. True to one of its core areas of study, the relationship between the individual and the group, organization, and wider context, this story too is both an individual and a systemic one. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is both Dickens and his Oliver Twist, and vice versa. Both Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby, and the Dickenses, Heathcliff, Jane Eyre, and the Brontes. The fictional orphan is set loose from established conventions to face a world of endless possibilities and dangers. The orphan leads the reader through a maze of experiences, encountering life's threats and grasping its opportunities. Browsing through the archives of the Tavistock Institute, I had a similar feeling. I had traveled from field notes of the Malabar in India to group interview notes of a consultation assignment to the advertising company producing pet food.
Microphone. One can then begin to relate it to the extent to which the family owns the dog, as opposed to those families where one gets the impression that the dog owns a family, such as my parents-in-law. One can then note the extent to which the pet becomes a child and may then be a special kind of child, in that it contains all the greedy projects from the infantile part of self, and the animal then becomes very petted and given a place of greater domination than would an actual real-life child.
This is John Hill writing. Tracking the Institute's work in the area of children in care, there are many worth noting, many more than I can do justice to in this space. Institute staff worked in schools, boarding, care homes, juvenile boarding in every decade. Not all work has been released, and some of it must still be kept confidential. However, here is some data. Between 58 and 66, Isabel Menzies, in collaboration with the World Health Organization, assessed the work of Child Guidance Clinic in Soissons, France, and made recommendations about future developments in mental health work with children. 62 to 63, she, together with Robin Higgins, studied the Royal Wanstead School, which is a residential educational institution for vulnerable young people facing abuse, neglect, or trauma at home. You have here on the top left a picture of the school's appeal for fundraising, because it was running out, and I think you can see a little bit of it, but Sadie is going to read to you from the proposal letter, which in those days, that's how we sometimes were able to write proposals. It was a 1.5 page, and and she says it all, Sadie.
Okay, with the rebuilding of your junior schools at Sawbridgeworth, your board wants to take the opportunity to provide the most acceptable conditions for younger children. We see that the most acceptable has to have a rather particular meaning. The ultimate arbiter of the acceptability is, of course, your board. But we take your point that this acceptability has also to include local education authorities and, in particular, children's officers. The conditions are thus partly educational and partly social, and as the authorities themselves have already access to both methods already proved in use and those now being developed experimentally, your board will need a careful survey and recommendations that are fully up to date. This is an area in which the Tavistock Institute can be of assistance.
The 70s saw Institute staff work in the Balderton Mental Hospital, working with kids with learning disabilities. The Brent Social Services Pilot Project, a local community study, which sought to understand the ways in which decisions on social policy were made at the local level. Starting in 1972 and continuing to 1980 was the work at Fairhaven, a hostel for educationally subnormal boys aged 16 to 19 in Blackheath, London. In the 80s, we find work on the youth training scheme, work with young people living care, and work on youth unemployment, which is not yet available as the history is too near and therefore is bounded by confidentiality. Back to 1964, Eric Miller and Robin Higgins worked with the Richmond Child Guidance Clinic with the aim of increasing the effectiveness of the clinic in dealing with referrals and reconceptualizing treatment as a social process to best relate to the needs of children. It turned out to be an early experiment in family therapy. Eric Miller writes in his field notes, starting from his reaction to the child he interviewed. He hasn't taken to this child, who was
an undersized, rather shifty-looking boy,
but he felt he was
subjected to excessive criticism and nagging from the parents, and this feeling must have shown through.
He writes further,
no man is an island. The patient is a symptom of a disturbed social system. The educational psychologist doesn't simply collect information. The questions they ask and the way in which they are asked will affect teachers' understanding of the problem, their image of the clinic, their perception of the course of action open to them, etc. It is important to ask questions which display concern for the child, not simply as an individual, but as a person in a complex environment.
The systemic psychoanalytic approach of the Tavistock Institute is evident in these notes, as in the letter Isabel wrote to the head of the school. Those field notes are captivating. Reading them, you can follow the thought process of the Tavistockian researcher and consultant and see pretty accurately how they then reach the analysis and conclusions they offer in their working notes. They are full of stories and full of orphans, just like Dickens's novels are. Through his characters, Dickens explores both heroic self-forming and feelings of abandonment, often combined. And the artful dodger in Oliver Twist can be easily imagined in the child above, described as shifty-looking child by Eric Miller. Dickens wrote Oliver Twist right after the success of the Pickwick Papers, and it was there that he started to develop a new literary genre, which was later called the social problem novel. Dickens had published Oliver Twist in the magazine Bentley's Miscellany, of which he was the editor. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations published its work through Tavistock Publications and through its journal Human Relations. And for a beautiful tale of human relations, please listen to Carrie Barner's short story, which is available on a loop in the exhibition space at the Swiss Church until tomorrow evening. Dickens' story of the Foundling Boy was a novel with a purpose, specifically targeting the Poor Law Act of 1834 and the cruelties of the workhouse system. It was not merely a bestseller, it changed hearts and even government thinking. Dickens realized with Oliver Twist that the novel in his hands could make the world a better place. His mother dying as she gave birth, Oliver is born without even a name in a workhouse. Because his parentage was unknown and could not be discovered, Oliver's name was given to him by the parish beadle, Mr. Bumble, who explained that he had an alphabetical list of names ready for any child born in the parish in similar circumstances. Mr. Bumble's slip, referring to fondlings instead of foundlings, might suggest that the children are well cared for, but as we know from the novel, in Oliver's case, they were not. In fact, at the Foundling Hospital, the same kind of naming custom was observed. The hospital comes actually from the idea of offering hospitality, was a very famous London institution, founded in the 1740s by an old sea captain called Thomas Coram, as a home for deserted children. Coram had been very distressed by knowledge of the large number of unwanted children that were found on doorsteps or under bushes, sometimes dead from exposure because found too late. His idea was for a charitable institution that would take in these unwanted children and care for them until they were of an age to fend for themselves. All children taken in as foundlings, even those whose names were known, were given entirely new identities at the outset. The hospital provided shelter, food, clothing, medical care, education, and work placements, so its children were well equipped to cope out in the world. That great institution occupied a large tract of land very close to Doughty Street, where Dickens and his young family were living while he was finishing Oliver Twist. The hospital was an impressive building, and it served as a model for the care of foundlings in other places. The site of the hospital is now a park, Coram's Fields, to the south of the British Library. Around 270 years after Thomas Coram founded the Foundling Hospital, and around 170 years after Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, Tavistock Institute colleagues are working for the Department for Education, studying children's social care innovation program projects, which include Coram Eyes program, improving permanency in foster placements. Coram Eyes still operates in the name of its founder to help today's vulnerable children. And our Dickenstockians are right there with them, trying to make the world a better place. After Oliver Twist, Dickens set his mind to Nicholas Nickleby. In this novel, Dickens's reforming target is the notorious Yorkshire boarding school industry, places even more inhumane, we are to understand, than the public workhouse described in Oliver Twist. This is the advertisement for the Bowes Hall school, and you can see right at the bottom, it says, "No vacations permitted." And this is the time just before they started to build the trains, which means to get to Yorkshire would have taken days. So children were shifted over to Yorkshire, essentially never to be seen again. Nicholas Nickleby was instrumental in destroying the Yorkshire school industry. Bowes Hall went out of business, as did other establishments of its kind, in 1840. It is estimated that there were less than 1,000 children victimized by the industry in 1839. By contrast, it was not until 1842, about 2 years after he published the book, that Parliament finally got round to passing the Mines Bill, which was prohibiting the employment of women and children under the age of 10 to go underground. There were many thousands of them in the coal mines of Yorkshire. 170 years later, the Tavistock Institute continues the work to promote children and young people's well-being and mental good health, less in institutions and more in examining and evaluating community and local government partnerships. For example, in the late 1990s, you will find Institute staff evaluating leadership in residential childcare, as well as the evaluation of CRACT, which was a theatre-based intervention for secondary school children with mental health. In the late 2000s to date, mental health services for vulnerable young people called Right Here, evaluating the Department of Education child poverty pilots, working with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime on the pilot to deliver forensic mental health intervention to young people at risk of violent offending. 2014, we worked with Nottingham County Council, fostering futures, building the research and delivery capability. 2015 has seen us working with London Borough of Havering, evaluation of the relaunch of a Children in Care Council. In Britain, adoption was legally unregulated until the 1920s, so it was easy and commonly informal. The governess in literature is in between, superior to any servant, yet not a member of the family. In novels, the job naturally belongs to an orphan who has no certain class identity. Similarly, the Tavistock Institute, an in-betweener, not an academic institute, yet scholarly, not a university, yet applied research, not a management consultancy outfit, yet a praxis consultancy, an independent organization that has the role of educator, a governor, or a governess. Jane Fairfax, that's in Jane Austen's Emma, is an orphan that has to become a governess, and she calls this occupation a kind of slavery. I think that my colleagues would agree that consulting and evaluating and researching sometimes too feel like a form of slavery. We are often enslaved to policies and agendas to which we do not necessarily ascribe and might struggle to free ourselves to challenge those from within our role, although being the Tavistock Institute, we mostly do, and sometimes at a cost, or at least at a risk, to our own revenue. The most famous female orphan of English Victorian literature is Jane Eyre. Like many orphans at the time, Jane, whose parents died when she was very young, has to be taken in by relatives. She is hardly cared for by her unloving aunt and is tormented by her cousins. She is then sent off to the appalling Lowood School, where most of the pupils are similarly abandoned. On her own in the world, Jane is eventually compelled to be a governess. Lucy Snow, the heroine and narrator of Bronte's final novel, Villette, also appears to be an orphan. She is forced to survive, first of all, as paid companion to an irritable old lady, and then as a junior teacher in a girls' school in Villette, which was, as my reading goes, a fictional version of Brussels. I suppose you're nobody's daughter, comments a spoiled pupil, and she is right. Bronte's exploration of female self-consciousness, featuring heroines who sometimes shocked contemporaries with their defiance and self-reliance, required her to orphan those heroines. Since 2015, the Tavistock Institute has been working with the Department for Education on evaluation of their Adoption Support Fund. Much has changed since Bronte's times, but the experience of utter loneliness and rejection at the heart of adoption remains, as do the defiance and self-reliance required in order to make a difference and an intervention with an impact. which is more than just descriptive or critical, but learningful and constructive. Colleagues who have worked on the Adoption Support Fund project have shared how they discovered their own dynamics of adoption and child rearing within their team, and how, through supervision and team discussions, they worked through those to benefit the client. Tavistock staff work ethics is rooted in its capacity to examine their own self-process and use it to make meaning of the situation they're studying. Back to the archives for an illustration of the roots of this rigor. The Cotswold Community Project was undertaken in a series of stages between the late 60s and the early 80s. It was a therapeutic residential community for boys between the ages of 9 and 16 who were diagnosed as emotionally unintegrated and therefore displayed often disruptive and delinquent behavior. The role of the Tavistock Institute was as a consultancy body to oversee and advise on the transformation of the management structure from a traditional hierarchical authority towards delegation of authority to the grassroots staff who dealt with the residents on a day-to-day basis. In the very first phase of the work, in January '68, we find Ken Rice visiting the school community for the first time, and he writes in his notes, microphone for Manny, please.
I am dictating this paragraph because somewhere inside me there's a feeling that all was not what it seemed.
He reflects on the change needed in the whole system.
The schools are run in a very authoritarian manner, with a powerful hierarchy supporting it, but above the headmaster there is complete confusion as to whom the headmaster is really responsible. This confusion enables almost anybody to be scapegoated if something really blows up. I found myself being in sympathy with a staff caught in the system which was in effect designed by the community to cope with its own projections about delinquency, perversion, and anything else that one can think of. It is the existence of what is so often denied that raises anxiety level to intolerable proportions. In effect, if you take out the hysteria of the reports of what was really going on in the school, it is really not very much worse than what exists in a number of public schools, and in terms of bullying is even less than the current film being shown of Tom Brown's School Days.
During one of his first school visits, Rice learns about the domestic details, including meal times, rooms, etc. He notes that it seems the importance of childcare is now recognized. This is after he discovered at least 4 cases of potential homosexual relationships, or rather rapes, that resulted in sacking staff, including eventually the then head teacher. And he says they do recognize that the need to have people who are sensitive to the needs of the children. However, he spoke to the chaplain who told him, "The past 3 years have damaged my sensitivity towards people and thus has pacified my ministry, both to staff and boys." But he writes in his notes that despite these recognitions,
nobody appears to have done a damn thing about their salary levels, and in consequence, the staff they get are usually driven into this job largely because they can't get anything else.
And after meeting the boys, he writes,
2 out of the 7 boys were of the most disturbed, and as you might expect, the most intelligent at the meeting. The boys had perhaps, not surprisingly, good ideas about what should be done.
So I'm trying to highlight how from the notes you can see how, first of all, how he's feeling about the relationship between recognizing work also through salary, and also something around the non-hierarchical nature of participation in creating something better together. I think it comes out from those notes. But even when not working directly in the area of child in care, Tavistock staff always have in mind the conscious, unconscious, sometimes hidden, and systemic issues of attitudes to children. Examining the notes from the Pets project is particularly revealing and enjoyable.
About cats' food, we could come no closer to an answer than to suggest that whereas the feeding and care of a dog raises the same general questions as the feelings of a child, nurturance, health, balanced diet, variety, and so on, the feeding of a cat is basically the necessary price to keep the cat around the house, catgeld. And extra offerings of food beyond this are more likely the food offerings made by Hindu villagers to their local temple gods. We do not believe that 1 in 10 persons are conscious that their attitude is one of worship. At the same time, we do not think they are unconscious of the Freudian sense of repression, but simply that in the vocabulary of our culture, we are no longer able to identify and label the complex of affects that constitute these primitive forms of worship, unless they are extreme and highly charged. There is room in the cat food market for a premium-priced food. It will be more in keeping with the nature of the offering if the food is fish from the ocean rather than the flesh of mammals, and the product should be clearly connected in the advertising with the qualities for which cats are worshipped, not with the notions of special loving care that one would use for premium dog foods. The catch in this is that historically cats have been worshipped for diverse and contradictory reasons. Our own judgment, and it is little more than a personal judgment, is that one should avoid any hint of the animal's savagery. The emphasis should be on those aspects that are central to Egyptian and Celtic mythology, a benign presence, independent enough to leave at any time, but indicating by its continued presence that this is a good home for the likes of it. More specifically, a home in which the group and organised social sides of man's existence are reasonably reconciled, and the former, which the cat symbolises, is not forcibly suppressed as simply evil.
More? Enough? More?
Okay. Each person must in himself manage some relation between these aspects of his existence. Whatever his solution, it will be subjected to further stress when he has to create in his own children a similar capacity to be partly blind and yet not completely and neurotically blind to the biological side of his social nature. We are suggesting that this may be a major reason for attachment to cats. If within a family there is a willingness to live with this side of their nature, then their home will be incomplete without a cat. To quote Mark Twain, a house without a cat and a well-fed, well-petted and properly revered cat may be a perfect house, perhaps, but how can it prove its title? If they are unable to live with this side of themselves, then they will not be able to tolerate the presence of cats.
You
Want more
decide.
pet? The pet comes to stand for helpless, abandoned, lost, and dependent part of self, a part of the self that was actually experienced in infancy and to some extent is retained in adult life. The part of the self that then feels abandoned and lost is thus looked after in the animal.
So this is the work of the Tavistock Institute. Who are the people, those Tavistockians? So I have a question for you. What do the Tavistockian, the Jew, and the Heathcliff have in common? Any ideas? It can be a start of a joke, but... Any ideas? None? The enigmatic orphan identity. When we try to explain to people what the Tavistock Institute is, it is always a mouthful, never quite succinct, never feels quite accurate. Eric Miller describes the difficulty so well.
My own professional identity does not itself fit within any neat disciplinary boundary. Faced with forms asking for profession or occupation, I'm never sure what to enter. Social anthropologist, that's something I was, but I'm no longer. Organizational consultant, but that's only part of what I do. Social science practitioner, rather a mouthful, and it still doesn't seem right. This comes of spending most of my working life at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations.
The pursuit to change the world, make it a better place, is no alien to the Tavistock Institute. In fact, it is its core mission and sometimes an irritant to itself and to people dealing with it. Tavistock Institute staff have not once been called arrogant and self-righteous on the one hand, dreamers who pitch above their weight on the other, small but mighty. Of course, many conspiracy theories have grown out and around the Institute's mastermind and mind control capacity. The oscillation between omnipotence to helplessness is both a friend and an enemy to the orphan and to the Tavistockian. The Tavistock Institute emerged out of the Tavistock Clinic in parallel to the founding of the NHS. Eric Miller described its inception days.
It is an institute that defines itself as multidisciplinary. No therapy without research, no research without therapy. So action research was to be central to the Tavistock Institute's mission, to advance the social sciences through involvement in practical human problems and concerns. And action research, by its nature, is problem-centered, not disciplinary-centered. Furthermore, for more than 40 years, it has struggled to occupy a space between academic social science on the one side and a commercial consultancy practice on the other.
Although it has succeeded in maintaining the stance of problem-centered organization and developed a reasonably distinctive identity, it has always seemed precarious. Partly because the Institute has always resisted commercializing of its own thought and practice, not always to its advantage, one might add, and partly because precariousness also applies to those who joined it. And to the time of the Institute's inception, the Institute emerged post-World War II, a precarious time, no doubt. Most of the Tavistock Institute founders, Wilfred Bion, Pierre Torquay, Howard Bridger, and Eric Trist, have served in the military as senior medics and officers, during which they helped develop the War Office selection boards at Northfield Military Hospital. The Tavistock Clinic psychoanalyst John Bowlby, father of attachment theory, also joined the group as a military doctor volunteer in 1940, and was a member of the group's research and training unit in Hampstead, which was established by the War Office in 1944. There was even a job there for the only woman at the Tavistock Institute at the time, Isabel Menzies. 1946-47 were also years that saw the partition of India and Israel, two milestones in the beginning of exposing the breaking and the failings of the Great British Empire. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was born an orphan and has had to adopt itself. Indeed, as a founding startup, it received a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. It had a home with the Tavistock Clinic, where its siblings, the clinicians, were busy organizing themselves into the new structure of the NHS, that's the National Health Service. The late 40s are the first of 3 periods where I could not find records of work with organizations whose primary task was the care for children and young people. This also gives data to my hypothesis. Whenever the Institute experienced orphanness and abandonment in itself, it withdrew from engaging with organizations who worked in the sector of the care for vulnerable and at-risk children and young people. Was that a conscious decision? Most probably an unconscious one and a systemic dynamic. The rationale would always be that work emerged elsewhere and staff were required in other areas, which of course was also true. But as I pursued my research and discovered the other twice where the Tavistock was not at work in the area of childcare, I have been convinced by this, and I will return to this shortly. How enigmatic is this identity? I have recently listened to a talk by the acclaimed Israeli author, A.B. Joshua. Some of you heard it firsthand with me as part of the OFEC 30th anniversary event in Tel Aviv early in September. He draws attention to the most informative act of identity formation in the Jewish account of its history. Whether a myth or a reality is irrelevant. The receipt of the Torah and the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. I was very taken by this particular point in his thesis. He says that the Jewish identity formation is embedded in 3 crucial words in God's request to Abraham. Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. 3 powerful entities are broken in this course of a single verse: land, homeland, father. And in turn, Abraham is given a land that is not a homeland, but a sacred land, a promised land, a territory that will be under the supervision of grace and God. A.B. Joshua is suggesting here that the identity, this is my interpretation of his suggestion, that the identity of the Jew as an immigrant, a wanderer, and a refugee was founded there. His argument takes us later into a separate discussion. However, for me, it was a critical point of learning to think of the Big Jewish Enigma as being about the problem of having to leave the homeland and go to live in and occupy a land which is given to the Jew conditionally. The problem of a people whose becoming of a nation was about being removed from the homeland, from the motherland, into a promised land, quite the opposite of most world's nations. The uprooting and reduction of the foundation of homeland in Israeli Jewish identity becomes clearer still in the difficult vision that is presented in the desert even before the actual entry to Israel. Moses warns the people, if after the settlement of the people in Israel they violate the commandments of God, whether in religious terms or moral terms, they shall be severely punished by their enemies, who are nothing more than the agents of God. And the culmination of calamity that will come down on the people is its expulsion from its land and its dispersion among the nations. However, and this is the fundamental innovation, even outside their homeland, the identity and existence of Israel will continue to be defined as a people of God. While in the case of other nations, the expulsion or loss of homeland also entails the loss of nationality, the children of Israel were promised national existence outside the homeland, for the homeland is not a prerequisite for national existence, only an additional condition, sometimes merely theoretical. The option of exile as a legitimate option within the structure of Jewish identity was given before the people had experienced a single moment of independence within their homeland. I would suggest, therefore, following his argument, that the Jewish identity is that of an abandoned child, deprived from a mother's unconditional love, which would be offered by a motherland, a father's home, and is dependent on being adopted into a loving home only if one can fit in and do what is expected of them. There is wisdom in this identity as one learns to adapt, to survive, to become part of, and also to lead. And we have seen the Jews do exactly that during the course of their history. Similarly, I suggest that the Tavistock Institute's unconscious narrative is also that of an orphan, and so it had had to be abandoned at least 3 times in its history in order to be where it is today. I just told you about the first time, its actual inception, as the NHS was formed. It developed in its own boundary around its social science applied research identity. Then again, in the early 90s, when it moved from Swiss Cottage to Tabernacle Street, and then again in 2006, when its Tabernacle home, the building, was sold. In both of these 2 periods, as well as in the late 40s, I could not find records of work of the Tavistock Institute in the area of child and young person well-being. When it moved physically from its joint base with the clinic and the trust to Tabernacle Street, where it still lives, that experience has gone down the history of the Tavistock as a great experience of abandonment and separation. Staff of both places would describe the experience as a split, a betrayal, and an abandonment when the Institute left its home of 50 years at Swiss Cottage and moved to the other side of London. A rational worker would probably think that the reactions to that move are somewhat melodramatic and excessive, and so they probably have been. What is more interesting, though, is to understand them within this proposed framework of the orphan. The feelings gave rise to anger, to defiance, and to creative action at the Tavistock Institute. Even though it is the Institute that had moved and had to start again, its people did not require sympathy. They kept heads high and carried on with their work mission. I remind you of Dickens' description of the infant Oliver, despised by all and pitied by none. When the building was sold in 2006, the Institute felt as though it had been torn apart from within. It was different to the 92 move, where the group, although feeling spat out and rejected, was nevertheless a group. This time, there was a real sense of being stripped off. However, 10 years on, we are celebrating the release of the first phase of the catalogued archives. This wouldn't have happened yet, in all likelihood, if the building wasn't sold, if the boxes of precious notes and reports were not put into storage for years to rot, and the current Institute management hadn't decided to take it all out of storage and have a good sift through it once and for all. All of the Tavi work would have probably still been stocked on the second floor of Tabernacle 30, gathering dust and moth. So, in organizational life, as in the novel, the orphan can defy their traumatic experience, rise its head, look forward, and find a creative new way to follow its quest. How does this all relate to Heathcliff? You might wonder. Heathcliff is one of the greatest enigmas in all of English literature. When we ask what seems like a simple question of Wuthering Heights, why is Heathcliff so appallingly vengeful to those such as Hareton Earnshaw who have done him no harm? We can find explanations in the terrible misfortunes of his life. He is an orphan. He is brutalized by Hindley. He is relegated to the status of a servant. Catherine marries Edgar. But the novel matches these kinds of social or psychological explanation by quite other ones, by the suggestion that he may be diabolical, a vampire, or a ghost. The novel gives us both kinds of understanding together. Neither is allowed to trump the other. Heathcliff is the dominant, overbearing presence, both outsider and insider, starving orphan and cruel landlord. Like the book itself, he is both remarkably self-disciplined and completely wild. What is most remarkable in Bronte's description of him is the combination of two apparently contradictory qualities. Resonances to the Tavistock Institute, anyone? Many of my colleagues, including myself, carry an identity of an orphan or an abandoned child. In writing this, I have recounted what I know from my colleagues about their lives. I also tested my thinking with some of them. The 4th floor of Tabernacle 30 is full of orphans and abandoned children. One was sent away as a child to be looked after by the aunt, reasons not altogether clear even now. A number of Tavistockians were sent to boarding school at tender ages, and for a number this has been a traumatic experience. These include, for example, John Bowlby, who was sent to boarding school aged 7 when the First World War came in 1914. He later maintained that the war and the supposed danger of air raids on London was just an excuse, being, and I quote, merely the traditional first step in the time-honored barbarism required to produce English gentlemen. Bion too was sent to boarding school in England from India, where he was born, and that was described in his biography. He was a victim of Victorian imperialistic manners which privileged austere education over the affective needs of the 8-year-old boy he was in 1906 when he was sent to a boarding school in England from where he never returned to his paternal home. The burden of losing one's home at such a tender age, the biographer writes, no wonder Bion became a specialist in the psychology of emptiness and the presence of absences. And by the way, some of you will recall that this was a subtitle of the Leicester Conference this year. Another told me of growing up in a house where father was drunk and mother regularly beaten up, with the children having to bring themselves up pretty much by themselves, and leaving home at the first opportunity, age 16, which most of us today would consider a rather tender age. Another grew up with 1 or 2 parents dysfunctional for their own struggle with mental health. Another was adopted at birth, and others have lost 1 or both parents at ages where their identity was still forming, challenging them to create circumstances for themselves beyond simply surviving. My colleagues also share disappointment in institutions around those times of trouble that were supposed to provide help and support but haven't. I myself am one such person with one such story. I was in the middle of my military service in Israel when my mother died after a short by aggressive illness, and with a father in a different country, and the military did all it could to release me from service, which was the least supportive act an organization could do for an orphan. Eric Miller suggested that the Tavistock Institute employees were all professional refugees. He certainly described himself as one. People who didn't quite fit either the domain of commerce or that of academia. Types of inevitable misfits. Gordon Lawrence also writes how he was advised to go to the Tavistock Institute as he didn't seem to fit anywhere else. I suppose this is partly why I have developed this hypothesis that the Tavistock Institute staff were always so determined to work with organizations such as the military, the hospitals, the care homes, the boarding schools. They wanted to ensure that their staff are as competent and skilled as possible in providing the care they set out to offer, to educate professionals on the needs of children, and to influence policymakers to ensure appropriate governance. The Tavistock Institute staff do what they preach, and a number of them have adopted or fostered children themselves. And as they are out there in the world helping others, they truly speak and intervene from experience. So, my friends, the untold story of the Tavistock orphan is now told, and what better than to end this talk novella with the fine words of Lewis Carroll from All in a Golden Afternoon, the poem that formed the preface of the book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Thus grew the tale of Taviland. Thus slowly, one by one, its quaint events were hammered out, and now the tale is done. Happy birthday. Thank you. We still have half an hour. My colleagues are spread around tables, which I'd like to call resonance tables. And I'd like to invite you for 10-15 minutes to share on the beautiful cards that Juliet drew, and we've printed a number of your resonances, thoughts, have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll bring it back into a plenary. And you might want to just talk about what is your resonance or dissonance or association to the experience of orphanness or abandonment, personally or professionally, and in relation to the Institute.